The story of Germany in the 20th century begins with despair. In 1918, the nation that had marched with pride into battle found itself broken, humiliated, and stripped of the very identity that once made it a powerhouse in Europe. Just 11 years earlier, it had stood proud among the great empires, and yet, by the end of the First World War, it was forced to its knees. From this humiliation, a man would rise who promised salvation, but who delivered only ruin. His name was Adolf Hitler, and he would reshape not just Germany, but the entire world in fire and blood. To understand how this happened, we need to look further back, to the Germany of the late 19th century. By then, the newly unified empire under the Prussian Hohenzollern dynasty had become the most prosperous and advanced country on the continent. Its industries were booming, its universities and scientists the envy of Europe. Germany had overtaken Britain in industrial production and was second only to the United States. It was ambitious, modern, and powerful. But it was also restless, for alongside prosperity came a militarized culture and a hunger for recognition. The German Empire longed to stand shoulder to shoulder with the British and French in their sprawling global empires. But it had arrived late to the race for colonies. That mix of envy and arrogance, of ambition and insecurity, created a volatile national character. Many European leaders viewed Germany not only as an industrial giant, but as a dangerously expansionist state that might upset the balance of power. The tensions built year after year until the First World War exploded in 1914. But our story does not begin in Berlin, nor in the corridors of power in the Reichstag. It begins in a quiet provincial town in Austria-Hungary, with the birth of a boy who would come to embody both the resentments and the ambitions of his age. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small town on the border between Austria and Germany. His father, Alois Hitler, was a stern and often violent customs official. His mother, Clara, was gentle and protective, showering the young Adolf with affection that only deepened after several of his siblings died in infancy. The household was far from happy. Alois was domineering, quick-tempered, and often abusive. Clara compensated by doting on her son, creating a child who learned both fear and entitlement in equal measure. Hitler's school years revealed little of the man he would become. He was intelligent, certainly, but unfocused, restless, and rebellious against authority. Teachers described him as bright but lazy, capable of applying himself but rarely choosing to. He spent much of his time daydreaming, sketching buildings, and imagining a future as an artist. Even as a boy, he developed the habit of voracious reading. He consumed books of history, mythology, and philosophy, but in a piecemeal way that gave him more enthusiasm than structure. What he lacked in discipline, he made up for in intensity, storing away fragments of ideas that he would later fuse into his own twisted worldview. In 1907, at the age of 18, Hitler travelled to Vienna with a dream. He would become a painter, perhaps even an architect, and leave behind the small-town life he so despised. Vienna at the time was one of the great capitals of Europe, a place where artistic modernism clashed with imperial grandeur and where radical political movements of every kind flourished. Hitler applied to the Academy of Fine Arts but was rejected, not once but twice. The professors judged his work lacking in originality, more suited for technical drafting than for true artistry. This rejection devastated him. He had pictured himself as a great artist, and suddenly the dream was gone. In Vienna, Hitler drifted. He lived in cheap lodgings, sold postcards of his watercolours, and scraped together enough to survive. He later exaggerated the poverty of these years, portraying himself as a near-destitute outcast, but in truth he never starved. He spent his days in cafes, absorbing the conversations of Vienna's bohemian intelligentsia. It was here that he encountered a toxic mix of ideas: radical nationalism, distorted Darwinian theories of racial struggle, and conspiracy-laden anti-Semitism. Though Hitler's personal interactions with Jewish people in Vienna were often positive, the family doctor who treated his mother was Jewish, as was the dealer who bought his paintings, he increasingly absorbed the city's atmosphere of prejudice. These were seeds that would bear terrible fruit later. By 1913, disillusioned and restless, Hitler left Vienna and moved to Munich in Germany. He insisted he felt more German than Austrian, and Munich offered him both cultural vibrancy and the chance to escape Austrian military conscription, which he detested. In Munich he continued to live modestly, drifting on the fringes of society, until events far larger than himself changed everything. In the summer of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. The murder ignited the tangled alliances of Europe, and within weeks the continent was at war. Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia, and Germany, bound to Austria by alliance, entered the conflict. France and Britain soon followed, and the First World War had begun. For many young men, war was a disaster. For Adolf Hitler, it was a calling. Despite being an Austrian citizen, he petitioned to join the German army, and in the chaos of mobilization his request was granted. He became a soldier in the Bavarian regiment of the German army. The transformation was immediate. The aimless drifter now had a uniform, a purpose, and a cause. The army provided the discipline and structure he had lacked all his life. He served as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between units at the front. It was a dangerous role, often requiring him to move under fire across exposed ground. By most accounts, he performed his duties bravely. He was awarded the Iron Cross, first and second class, though he never rose above the rank of corporal. Some comrades respected his courage, others found him aloof and eccentric. He kept largely to himself, immersing in books and political discussions, rarely joining the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers. The war was brutal. Trench warfare on the Western Front consumed millions of lives. Hitler saw comrades cut down by artillery and machine gun fire, endured the mud, the rats, the gas attacks. In 1918, near the end of the war, he himself was temporarily blinded by mustard gas. Lying in a hospital bed as Germany collapsed, he learned that his nation had sued for peace. For Hitler, it was a crushing blow. He had believed the war would bring Germany glory. Instead, it brought defeat, revolution, and humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles, which followed, imposed harsh penalties on Germany, massive reparations, territorial losses, and severe restrictions on its military. To many Germans, this was not just defeat, it was disgrace. And for Hitler, the humiliation burned like acid. From this cauldron of bitterness, his worldview hardened. He accepted the stab-in-the-back myth promoted by right-wing circles, that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed at home by socialists, communists, and Jews. This poisonous belief would become central to his political identity. While millions of Germans grieved and tried to rebuild their shattered lives, Hitler began to channel his fury into something new. He had failed as an artist. He had found temporary purpose as a soldier. Now he sought destiny as a political leader. This was the first transformation. From the boy of Braunau to the failed artist of Vienna to the embittered veteran of a lost war. The stage was set for the next chapter, when he would enter the turbulent Germany in the aftermath of the First World War was a nation staggering under the weight of humiliation. The Kaiser had abdicated, the monarchy was gone, and in its place rose the fragile Weimar Republic, a parliamentary democracy few Germans trusted. Revolution swept the streets in 1918 and 1919. Spartacist uprisings from the far left clashed with Freikorps militias from the far right. Political assassinations became almost routine. Inflation spiraled as the government printed money to pay war reparations. For millions, the struggle to find food and heat became part of daily life. To many veterans, including Adolf Hitler, the new republic seemed not a beacon of freedom, but a betrayal of everything they had fought for. Hitler himself remained in the army for several years after the war, though the once mighty German military had been reduced to a skeleton force of 100,000 men. For him, the uniform provided both structure and purpose. It also provided opportunity. The army began organizing educational courses for soldiers, designed not just to instruct but to immunize them against Bolshevik propaganda. These sessions were in truth vehicles for nationalist indoctrination. Hitler attended, listened, and soon discovered that he had a gift. His speeches to fellow soldiers were fiery, emotional, and laced with themes of betrayal, pride, and destiny. Officers took notice. Before long, he was no longer just a student of propaganda. He was delivering it. In September 1919, the army sent Hitler to observe a tiny political group in Munich known as the German Workers' Party. Founded by a locksmith named Anton Drexler, the party was little more than a collection of malcontents meeting in beer halls. Its ideas, however, echoed Hitler's own resentments: nationalism, hatred of Marxists, suspicion of Jews, and the belief that Germany had been wronged by Versailles. Hitler attended a meeting, listened, and then spoke. His passion electrified the room. Within weeks he joined, and soon he was more than a member. He was the party's most compelling voice. It was here that Hitler's transformation into a political figure began. He had found a stage, an audience, and a message. His speeches drew on personal conviction, but also instinctive showmanship. He spoke with rising fury, his voice breaking, his gestures sharp and theatrical. Audiences who came out of curiosity left feeling as if they had been swept up in something larger than themselves. In the smoky air of Munich's beer halls, a new kind of politics was being born. By 1920, Hitler had persuaded the party to change its name. The German Workers' Party became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazi Party. The new name blended nationalism with socialism, designed to appeal broadly across the fractured political spectrum. A new symbol was chosen, the swastika, rotated and set against a field of red, black, and white. Hitler himself claimed credit for the design, insisting it conveyed dynamism, unity, and racial destiny. With the new name and symbol came a new strategy. The party would not simply be a discussion circle, it would be a movement. As the 1920s unfolded, Hitler attracted a circle of loyal followers who would later become infamous. There was Rudolf Hess, the devoted aide who regarded Hitler with almost religious awe. Hermann Goering, the decorated fighter ace who brought glamour and military prestige. Heinrich Himmler, mild in manner but radical in thought, who dreamed of an ethnically pure Germany. Joseph Goebbels, intellectual, propagandist, and future master of mass manipulation. Martin Bormann, cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient. Each man brought something different, but all were bound by Hitler's magnetism. The party also attracted rougher elements: veterans, street fighters, men who felt cheated of glory in the war. Out of these, Hitler formed the Sturmabteilung, or SA, also known as the Brown Shirts. Dressed in military-style uniforms, they acted as the party's private army, disrupting opponents' meetings, intimidating rivals, and giving Nazi rallies an air of disciplined force. Violence and politics became intertwined, each feeding the other. But for all the energy of its meetings, the Nazi Party in the early 1920s remained a fringe movement. Other right-wing groups were larger, more influential, better funded. What changed Hitler's fortunes was not his own strength, but inspiration from abroad. In October 1922, Benito Mussolini and his fascists marched on Rome. Though in truth, Mussolini was invited to form a government rather than seizing it by force, Hitler saw only the image: black-shirted legions, a leader of destiny, and a nation transformed overnight. If Mussolini could do it in Italy, why not in Germany? By 1923, Germany was in chaos once again. French and Belgian troops had occupied the Ruhr Valley after Germany defaulted on reparations payments. Workers went on strike. The government printed money to support them, and hyperinflation spun out of control. Banknotes were so worthless they were used as wallpaper. Savings vanished overnight. Middle-class families found themselves destitute. Hunger and despair spread. It seemed the Weimar government was incapable of holding the country together. For Hitler, this was the moment. He believed the time had come to seize power. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and 600 brown shirts stormed into the Bürgerbräukeller, a vast beer hall in Munich, where Bavarian officials were gathered. Firing a pistol into the air, Hitler declared that the revolution had begun. Government leaders were held at gunpoint and told to support his cause. Through the night, chaos reigned. By morning, Hitler and his followers marched into the streets, hoping to rally the army and police to their side. But the support never came. Instead, they met armed resistance. Shots were fired. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen lay dead. The coup, later called the Beer Hall Putsch, collapsed in humiliation. Hitler fled, was arrested, and charged with treason. The trial that followed might have destroyed him. Instead, it elevated him. In the courtroom, Hitler transformed the proceedings into a national platform. He raged against the Weimar government, denounced Versailles, and portrayed himself as a patriot willing to sacrifice everything for Germany. Journalists printed his every word. The judges, sympathetic to his nationalist message, handed down a lenient sentence: 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole. In the end, he served barely 9 months, held in relative comfort at Landsberg prison. It was during this imprisonment that Hitler began to see himself not just as a political agitator, but as a man of destiny. With Rudolf Hess as his secretary, he dictated the book that would become Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Part autobiography, part political manifesto, part fevered prophecy, it laid out his worldview: the centrality of race, the hatred of Jews, the dream of a German empire built on conquest and purity. The prose was dense, rambling, and repetitive, yet its ideas were stark. Germany, he argued, must unite under a single leader, destroy Marxism, crush its enemies, and expand eastward to gain living space. The book sold modestly at first, but over the years it would become a cornerstone of Nazi ideology. When Hitler left prison in December 1924, he faced a changed political landscape. The attempted putsch had discredited radical coups. The government was stabilizing, aided by American loans under the Dawes Plan. Inflation was tamed, industry revived, and a fragile prosperity returned. The Nazi Party itself had fractured during his absence. If Hitler was to succeed, he realized, it would not be through force, but through strategy. He would pursue power legally, using the tools of democracy to destroy democracy itself. The ban on his public speaking was gradually lifted, and he returned to the stage with renewed determination. His rallies grew in scale and spectacle. Banners, uniforms, music, and torchlight created an atmosphere that blended politics with theatre, emotion with ritual. Audiences were swept up not just by words, but by a sense of belonging, of participating in something greater. For a nation still traumatized by defeat, Hitler's promise of unity and renewal was intoxicating. Yet by the late 1920s, the Nazis remained a minor force. In the 1928 elections, they won only 2.6% of the vote, securing a handful of seats in the Reichstag. Other parties dismissed them as extremists destined to fade into obscurity, and perhaps they would have, had the world not changed again. In October 1929, the American stock market crashed. Banks collapsed, industries failed, and the global economy spiraled into depression. For Germany, the impact was catastrophic. Dependent on American loans and investment, the Weimar Republic suddenly found itself without support. Businesses shuttered, unemployment soared to 6 million. Families who had rebuilt their lives after the inflation now lost everything once more. Hunger, poverty, and desperation returned deeper than before, and with them returned the anger, the resentment, the search for scapegoats. Into this storm stepped Hitler and the Nazi Party. No longer fringe, they now offered themselves as the only force capable of restoring order, pride, and strength. The message was simple: Germany had been betrayed, weakened, humiliated. But under Hitler, it would rise again. The despair of millions became the fertile ground in which extremism took root, and from those roots would grow a movement that would shake the world to its core. 100 words. The crash of 1929 turned crisis into catastrophe. For Germany, it was as if a fragile house of cards had collapsed in an instant. Factories closed, banks failed, and millions of workers were thrown onto the streets. By 1932, nearly 1 in 3 Germans was unemployed. Soup kitchens overflowed, children went hungry, and the middle class, once proud of its stability, found itself ruined yet again. The despair was not just economic, but psychological. A nation that had once led the world in science, industry, and culture now begged for bread. In such times, people turned to voices that promised certainty. The Nazis were ready. Their propaganda machine roared into action, portraying Hitler as the only man capable of saving Germany. Posters showed him as a messianic figure, his eyes gazing toward a radiant future. Slogans were simple, direct, unforgettable. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one nation, one leader. The rallies grew larger, louder, more choreographed. Torchlight parades, martial music, and the sea of swastika flags gave attendees the sense of being swept into a powerful tide. At a time when most parties seemed timid and divided, the Nazis projected strength. The electoral results reflected this surge. In the Reichstag elections of 1930, the Nazis leapt from the margins to win over 6 million votes, making them the second largest party in Germany. 2 years later, in July 1932, they became the largest party, with more than 13 million votes and 230 seats. What had begun as a fringe movement of angry veterans and drifters was now a mass party with national reach. The Nazis drew support from every corner of German society: the unemployed and the fearful middle class, radical students and disillusioned farmers, ex-soldiers and those who simply longed for stability. Central to this success was Hitler himself. He toured the country tirelessly, speaking to packed halls and stadiums. His speeches followed a calculated rhythm. He would begin slowly, his voice almost conversational, acknowledging the doubts of the people. Gradually his pace quickened, his tone sharpened, his body language grew more animated. By the end, he was shouting, fists pounding, voice hoarse with passion. The crowd shouted back, chanting, saluting, swept into frenzy. It was theatre, but theatre with deadly conviction. Many who witnessed him in person described feeling hypnotized, as if his voice bypassed reason and struck directly at the emotions. But Hitler was not just an orator. He was also a master manipulator of modern technology. The Nazis used radio broadcasts to reach homes, films to capture rallies, and airplanes to carry Hitler across Germany in the so-called Hitler over Germany campaign. In an era when politics still often relied on local meetings and leaflets, this was revolutionary. Hitler seemed omnipresent, a leader who could appear in multiple cities in a single day, a man of action while others argued endlessly in the Reichstag. Still, power remained elusive. Germany was not yet ready to hand him full control. President Paul von Hindenburg, the aged field marshal revered as a hero of the First World War, distrusted Hitler. He saw him as a dangerous upstart, a demagogue unfit for high office. Twice Hitler demanded the chancellorship, and twice Hindenburg refused. Behind the scenes, conservative elites, industrialists, landowners, military leaders, debated how to use Hitler's popularity without surrendering to him. They believed they could harness the energy of the Nazis while keeping real power in their own hands. The turning point came in January 1933. After months of political deadlock, backroom deals, and pressure from right-wing advisers, Hindenburg relented. On January 30th, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The conservatives who engineered this thought they had outmaneuvered him. One politician, Franz von Papen, boasted that they had hired Hitler, that they would box him in with traditional ministers and restrain his excesses. They could not have been more wrong. Within days, Hitler began to dismantle the very system that had elevated him. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided the perfect pretext. When the Parliament building went up in flames, the Nazis blamed the communists, claiming it was the signal for a Bolshevik revolution. Whether or not the Nazis themselves had a hand in the fire remains debated, but the result was clear. Fear swept the nation. Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the press, privacy of correspondence, all were stripped away. Thousands of communists, socialists, and critics were arrested. The machinery of dictatorship was already grinding into motion. The next step was the March 1933 elections. Though still not commanding a majority, the Nazis used violence and intimidation to suppress opponents. Stormtroopers patrolled polling places, rival meetings were banned, and newspapers silenced. With this manufactured advantage, the Nazis and their nationalist allies secured a slim majority. Yet even this was not enough for Hitler. He wanted absolute power, unchecked by Parliament. He wanted legality to cloak dictatorship. And so he pushed for the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act, passed on March 23, 1933, gave Hitler the authority to enact laws without Reichstag approval, even laws that violated the Constitution. To pass, it required a two-thirds majority. In the Kroll Opera House, guarded by SA men, surrounded by fear, the deputies voted. Only the Social Democrats stood against it, their leader declaring, "You can take our lives and freedom, but you cannot take our honor." All others either supported or abstained. The act passed. Democracy in Germany was dead. The dictatorship had begun. From that moment, the transformation of Germany accelerated with terrifying speed. Opposition parties were banned. Trade unions were dissolved and replaced with the Nazi-controlled German Labour Front. State governments were subordinated to Berlin. The press became a mouthpiece for propaganda. The swastika flag, once a symbol of a fringe party, now fluttered from every government building. The greeting Heil Hitler became compulsory. Step by step, the private lives of Germans were absorbed into the totalitarian state. Fear was the foundation. The Gestapo, the secret police, emerged as the enforcers of loyalty. Informants spread through neighborhoods, workplaces, even families. A careless word could mean arrest. Concentration camps, the first of them at Dachau, were open to imprison political opponents. Though still small compared to what they would later become, they sent a chilling message. Dissent would not be tolerated. Terror was no longer the weapon of fringe militias, it was the policy of the state. And yet, alongside fear came seduction. The Nazis understood that dictatorship could not rest on repression alone. They offered spectacle, ritual, and a sense of belonging. The Nuremberg rallies became annual pilgrimages, vast pageants of choreography, sound, and light. Columns of men marched in perfect unison, banners glowed in torchlight, speeches echoed through the night air. For attendees, it was not politics, but a kind of secular religion. Hitler was the high priest, the embodiment of Germany's destiny. For millions, life did seem to improve in those first years. Public works projects created jobs. The Autobahn network, still modest but expanding, symbolized progress. Rearmament, though forbidden by Versailles, secretly and then openly revived industry and the military. Unemployment fell. Order returned to the streets. For those who longed for stability after years of crisis, Hitler seemed to have delivered. They ignored, or chose not to see, the cost. The erosion of freedom, the silencing of voices, the persecution of minorities. The consolidation of power reached its climax in 1934. President Hindenburg, now old and frail, remained the last obstacle to Hitler's absolute control. But before Hindenburg died, Hitler faced a challenge from within. The SA, his stormtrooper army, had grown to millions and demanded a greater role. Its leader, Ernst Röhm, dreamed of merging the SA with the regular army, creating a revolutionary force that would rival even Hitler's authority. The conservative elites, the military, and even many Nazis grew alarmed. They whispered of chaos, of Rome as a threat. Hitler acted with ruthless precision. On the night of June 30th, 1934, he unleashed what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. Rome and dozens of SA leaders were arrested and executed. Other rivals, critics, and inconvenient figures were also eliminated. The killings sent a clear signal. Loyalty to Hitler was absolute, and betrayal would mean death. The army, reassured that Hitler had curbed the SA, pledged allegiance to him personally. When Hindenburg died weeks later, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor. He assumed a new title, Führer, leader. From then on, every soldier, every official, every citizen was bound by oath not to the Constitution, not to the nation, but to Adolf Hitler himself. By 1934, the transformation was complete. In less than 2 years, Hitler had gone from a chancellor boxed in by rivals to a dictator with unchecked power, through fear, propaganda, violence, and political war. Audiobook script Part 4, 2,500 words. By the summer of 1934, Adolf Hitler stood as the unchallenged master of Germany. The old order was gone. The monarchy had been swept aside in 1918, the Weimar Republic dismantled in 1933, and now even internal rivals within the Nazi movement had been eliminated during the Night of the Long Knives. When President Hindenburg died that August, Hitler merged the office of president with that of chancellor and proclaimed himself Führer of the German Reich. The oath of loyalty sworn by every soldier and civil servant no longer bound them to the state or its constitution, but directly to him. A single man, once a fringe agitator shouting in Munich beer halls, now held in his hands the fate of an entire nation. The regime Hitler built was totalitarian in the truest sense. It sought to dominate every aspect of life, from politics and the economy to culture, education, and even private relationships. The Nazi Party became not merely a political organization, but the central nervous system of the state. Membership grew rapidly, as careerists and opportunists recognized that advancement depended on loyalty to the party. Government ministries were infiltrated by party officials, and regional leaders, the Gauleiters, acted as little dictators in their territories, answerable only to Hitler. Terror underpinned it all. The Gestapo, the secret police, was relatively small in numbers but vast in influence. relying on a network of informants who penetrated every corner of society. Fear spread that neighbors, colleagues, or even family members might denounce one another. The concentration camp system, begun with Dachau in 1933, expanded. At first it held political prisoners, communists, social democrats, and other dissidents, but soon it encompassed a broader category of so-called enemies of the state. For those inside, brutal discipline, forced labor, and arbitrary violence became daily reality. Though the full horrors of the later extermination camps were not yet in place, the foundations were being laid. Propaganda was the lifeblood of the regime. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, orchestrated a campaign that saturated German life with Nazi ideology. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, posters, even children's books carried the same themes: devotion to the Führer, racial purity, national unity, and the promise of renewal. Modern technology was exploited with ruthless efficiency. Radios, once luxury items, were made affordable so that every household could hear Hitler's speeches. Films like Triumph of the Will showcased the spectacle of the Nuremberg rallies, with vast formations of soldiers, banners, and torchlight designed to awe audiences into submission. Even leisure was co-opted. The Strength Through Joy program organized state-approved holidays and entertainment, blending relaxation with indoctrination. Every facet of life became a stage for the Nazi message. Central to that message was race. Hitler's worldview, laid out in Mein Kampf, was built on the belief that history was a struggle between races, and that the so-called Aryan race was destined to rule. Other peoples, particularly Jews, were portrayed as parasites and enemies. Anti-Semitism, long a feature of European prejudice, was elevated to state doctrine. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship, forbade marriage or sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, and codified discrimination into law. Jewish businesses were boycotted, professionals expelled from their jobs, children segregated in schools. The intention was clear: to isolate, humiliate, and ultimately remove Jews from German life. The persecution did not stop there. Roma people, labeled gypsies, were targeted as racially inferior. Homosexuals were arrested and sent to camps. People with disabilities were sterilized under programs of so-called racial hygiene. The Nazi obsession with purity extended into every corner of society. It was a vision of community defined not by inclusion but by exclusion, where belonging meant embracing hatred of the other. At the same time, Hitler embarked on a program of rearmament that defied the Treaty of Versailles. The restrictions imposed in 1919 had limited the German army to 100,000 men, banned tanks and aircraft, and curtailed the navy. Hitler ignored all of it. In 1935, he openly announced the creation of the Luftwaffe, a new air force, and reintroduced conscription, expanding the army to hundreds of thousands. The West protested, but feebly. Britain and France, still haunted by the slaughter of the First World War and mired in economic depression, were unwilling to confront Germany. Instead, they watched, issued diplomatic notes, and hoped Hitler's ambitions could be contained. For many Germans, rearmament was a source of pride. Jobs returned as factories produced weapons, tanks, and planes. Unemployment, once a crushing burden, fell dramatically. The Autobahn network expanded, showcasing modern engineering and symbolizing national renewal. Hitler presented himself as the man who had rescued Germany from despair and restored its strength. His speeches spoke of peace, but his actions prepared for war. Foreign policy soon tested the resolve of Europe. In 1936, Hitler ordered German troops into the Rhineland, a region demilitarized by Versailles and guaranteed by treaty with France. It was a gamble. The German army was not yet ready for major conflict. If France had responded militarily, Hitler would have been forced to retreat. But France hesitated and Britain counseled restraint. The gamble paid off. German soldiers marched unopposed, greeted by cheering crowds. The lesson was clear. Boldness would be rewarded. Hesitation would paralyze his enemies. That same year, Germany drew closer to fascist Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, and to militarist Japan. Together they signed agreements that laid the foundation for what would later become the Axis alliance. Meanwhile, Hitler tested his military strength indirectly by sending troops, aircraft, and equipment to aid Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. The conflict became a proving ground for new tactics, especially aerial bombing. The destruction of Guernica by the German Condor Legion foreshadowed the horrors of the next global war. Inside Germany, the cult of the Führer deepened. Schoolchildren learned songs praising Hitler. Portraits of him hung in classrooms and offices. His birthday became a national holiday. To millions, he was not just a political leader, but the embodiment of the nation itself. This devotion was carefully crafted, but also eagerly embraced. For those who benefited from restored jobs and national pride, it seemed easier to ignore the dark underside. The silenced press, the banned parties, the neighbours who disappeared after a midnight knock. The dark underside revealed itself with terrible clarity in November 1938. That month, following the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a Jewish teenager, Nazi leaders unleashed violence against Jews across Germany and Austria. Synagogues were set ablaze, Jewish shops were smashed, homes invaded, families beaten in the streets. Windows shattered across cities and towns, giving the pogrom its name, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. More than 90 Jews were murdered, thousands arrested, and entire communities terrorized. It was no longer about social exclusion or legal discrimination. It was about open, state-sanctioned violence. The message was unmistakable. Jews had no place in Hitler's Germany. By then, the regime was turning increasingly outward. Hitler's ambitions stretched far beyond Germany's borders. He dreamed of uniting all Germans into a single Reich and expanding eastward into vast territories that would provide the living space he believed essential for the Aryan race. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria in the Anschluss, greeted by jubilant crowds. The annexation was presented as a union of brothers, a homecoming of one people. Once again, Britain and France protested, but did not act. Next came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a significant German-speaking population. Tensions rose and Europe braced for war. But at the Munich conference in September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French leaders chose appeasement. They ceded the Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for promises of no further territorial demands. Chamberlain returned to London, declaring, "Peace for our time." In truth, it was only a pause before catastrophe. 6 months later, Hitler broke his word and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. By 1939, the path to war was clear. Hitler's next target was Poland, but he faced a problem. If Germany attacked, it risked fighting a war on two fronts, against France and Britain in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. The solution was audacious. In August 1939, Hitler and Joseph Stalin stunned the world by signing the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression treaty. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, granting the Soviets Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and more. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler prepared to strike. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, unleashed tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry in devastating coordination. Cities were bombed, armies encircled, resistance crushed with shocking speed. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world conflict Hitler had both feared and desired had begun. For the German people, the years of spectacle and preparation had led to this. They marched behind their Führer into a war that would consume tens of millions of lives, devastate continents, and reveal the true depths of the regime's monstrous ambitions. The dictatorship that had begun with promises of renewal now embarked on a path of destruction that would scar humanity forever.